All right, so today we're going to talk about the plasma membrane of cells. So to begin, I want you to recall back from our very first unit in biology this year, and I want you to think about the word homeostasis. Okay. And remember, what did it mean when a living organism had to maintain homeostasis? So just a refresher, homeostasis is just the process of maintaining balance in an organism's internal environment, right? So like for humans, when we get hot, we're going to sweat to cool down. Or the opposite, when I get cold, I'm going to shiver. So it's that ability to maintain that internal balance. And so homeostasis, it's essential for cell survival. You have to be able to maintain your internal conditions. And so what is primarily responsible for maintaining homeostasis is the plasma membrane. All right, so here on the left is a computer-generated picture of the plasma membrane. And you can think of the plasma membrane as similar to a fence with gates. So it controls what enters and what leaves the cell. It's also a boundary between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. So for anything that wants to go in or out of the cell, it has to go through the plasma membrane. And just like a fence with your gate, sometimes like the gates can easily open and allow some substances in. Other times, think of it as like if the gate's closed, it prevents something from getting in or get out. Okay. And so by that feature, the plasma membrane, it just helps the cell maintain those internal conditions, right? Like ions and water and just nutrients and waste, they can't just come and go in and out of the cell as they please. It has to happen in an orderly fashion, which is helping the cell maintain homeostasis. And this is so important. Every single cell that has ever evolved has a plasma membrane. Okay, so make sure you have this in your notes. So all cells have a plasma membrane. It doesn't matter if it's a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell, they all have a membrane. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is just a thin layer of lipids and proteins. And again, think of it as just like a boundary. So all it does is separate the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And then just my fun little fact about how small the plasma membrane is just an example here. So cell membranes, they're about 5 to 10 nanometers thick. Okay, so that's super tiny. So a stack of 10,000 membranes would be as thick as a sheet of paper. Okay, and that's not length or width like the 8x11. I'm talking like the thickness, which is so thin. Okay, so 10,000 membranes stacked would be the same thickness as your piece of paper right now. All right, so let's look at the membrane a little bit closer. Okay, so here's kind of like a blown up picture of the membrane. Okay. So the membrane is mainly made up of these phospholipids. So hopefully that word sounds a little bit familiar from the previous chapter when we talked about lipids. One of the polymers of lipids is the phospholipid. Okay, so if we look at just one of these, I'm going to just draw one in yellow. So here we get our phospholipid, okay, and then this is like our fatty acid chain coming down. Okay, so that whole structure is called a phospholipid. And when the membranes develop in like a watery solution, it automatically is going to develop 2 rows of it. Okay, so we would call this a phospholipid bilayer. So if we look at vocabulary, bi means 2 and then just layer. Okay, so 2 layers of these phospholipids. And the reason for that is these phospholipids, they have something called a hydrophilic end and a hydrophobic end. Okay. So let's look in more depth of what those words mean. Okay, so hydro is going to mean water. Okay, so I'm just going to write H2O for water. And then part of it is hydrophilic. Okay. So philic means like you love it. All right, so hydrophilic means water loving, okay? So this part of the phospholipid loves water. The same is true for down here. The other word is hydrophobic. So hydro means water, but now phobic means like fearing or hate. Okay. So I'm going to put hate. So it hates water. So if something is hydrophobic, it fears water, it hates water. So these fatty acid tails, these parts, they hate water. And so the main solution inside of a cell and outside the cell is going to be water. So these parts of the phospholipid, they hate water. So what happens is you get a double layer here. So the two sides that hate water, they're going to face each other and become internal. And then the sides that love water, they're going to take the outside that is going to touch the water molecules. So the side that loves water is going to be near water, and the side that hates water is going to naturally range so it doesn't have to be near the water. Okay. So again, the name is phospholipid bilayer, and it's called that because each of these are phospholipids, and it makes two layers. Okay, so that is the basic structure of the plasma membrane. So at the very beginning, we compared the plasma membrane to like a fence with a gate. So it allows some things to enter and exit the cell while it keeps other things out. So the cell membrane, it is called selectively permeable, okay, or it has this property of selective permeability. So selective just means like choosy. So it can choose what comes in and comes out. Permeable means something can get by, okay, or it can come in or come out. So cell membranes, they are semi-permeable or selectively permeable. Okay, so what that means is some things can enter and exit freely from the cell, and other things cannot. So small molecules like water, they can pass freely through the cell. So water can go into the cell, water can exit the cell, and it's a free process. It comes and goes as needed. And we will talk about that at the end of the chapter of how do we know if water is going to enter or exit the cell. Okay. But also when we talk about selective permeability, not everything can. So your larger molecules like proteins and carbohydrates, they can't just come and go from the cell as they please. There are special processes to either bring those in or have them exit the cell. Okay. Also, other small molecules like a charged ion also doesn't easily cross the membrane. So it's not just a function of size of molecule. It has to do with other properties as well. So if you look at this picture over here, it's computer generated, but it's meant to represent the cell membrane. So this yellow here would be like the membrane. Think of this as like the inside of a cell and this part as the outside of the cell. And so here are like the holes that would let things in, right? So some little things that can just fit through there, they can go in and out as they please. But here I have like my large molecule, they can't just go in and out. All right, so now I want to talk about just some other features that help make up the plasma membrane. So on the previous slide, we were talking about the selective permeability of the membrane, which means not everything can just enter and exit the membrane as it pleases. So the first thing, or the first feature or structure of the plasma membrane I want to talk about is something called a transport protein. So when we look at the word transport, hopefully you're thinking transportation or movement. So these are proteins that span like the entire thickness of the plasma membrane. And they either allow certain substances in through the plasma membrane and into the cell, or they allow certain waste materials out of the cell and into that external environment. At the end of the chapter, we will go through like a whole section more about proteins and functions of how you get things in or out of the cell. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in depth later. The second feature I want to talk about is cholesterol. So cholesterol, it's non-polar, okay, which means it also hates water. So you're going to find it on the inside of the plasma membrane. Okay, so you're going to find it by the hydrophobic fatty acid tails. And the function of the cholesterol is it just prevents these fatty acid chains from sticking together. Okay? So it just allows the plasma membrane to keep on maintaining doing its job. And then finally, the plasma membrane has carbohydrates throughout. Okay, so this is a carbohydrate, so they stick out of the plasma membrane, and they help cells identify chemical signals. So, for example, they might help a disease-fighting cell recognize and attack a potentially harmful cell, so like a pathogen or a bacteria. All right, so this phospholipid bilayer, it can create kind of like a sea, if you think of it, kind of like a sea, in which other molecules can float. So they just kind of move around in this solution. And the best model to represent the plasma membrane is something called the fluid mosaic model. So this computer-generated diagram here, this just follows the fluid mosaic model. So kind of think of the membrane as being kind of like elastic and fluid, and that is like our best model to represent the membrane. So that's all I want to talk about for plasma membrane today. Later on, after we do cell organelles, we will come back to the plasma membrane and we'll talk about it more in depth. So the last thing I want you to do today is visit this link and watch this one YouTube video on the plasma membrane.